news we have on the Iran talks and
Sure.
potential anything going on. It sounds kind of like good news as long as you don't talk to the Americans. Then it doesn't sound like great news. But
Well,
Iran saying what the West has new realism at talks. That sounds like good news.
yeah, yeah. It's based off of, we had this conversation last week. Uh, essentially, what my interpretation of things that was going on was that the Iranians really had gained the upper hand in the negotiations by sticking to their guns and remaining steadfast and pushing against the pressure from the Europeans and the Americans and the Israelis. And they said, no, 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 no. We're demanding sanctions relief, and we're going to negotiate these draft proposals we've put forward. Those previous draft agreements that you had with Rouhani, notwithstanding, those were full of brackets and not officially anything. So, and then ultimately in the seventh round, we're in the eighth round now. They paused for New Year's and then restarted on January 3rd. Ironically, that's the anniversary of Soleimani's assassination, the general. But yeah, so the eighth round of talks is picking up. Basically, it's after the pivotal seventh round where they decided that actually, yeah, we're going to negotiate on the basis of these new terms put forward by the Iranians, which essentially, I mean, they're demanding a full implementation of the JCPOA and comprehensive sanctions relief. They also want guarantees from the Americans that they won't leave the deal again, and I believe that they're looking for some sort of a verification period to guarantee sanctions relief before they. I think that's very smart, actually, in order to so that they don't cede their leverage too soon, which would be frankly disastrous from their perspective. So we had the Iranians coming out, and so this is Saeed Khatibzadeh, the foreign ministry spokesman. He says, we sense a retreat, or rather realism, from the Western parties in the Vienna negotiations, that there can be no demands beyond the nuclear accord. He said and then he kind of turned the State Department's rhetoric back around on them, and he goes, it's still too soon to judge if the United States and the European countries have drawn up a real agenda to commit to lifting sanctions. Because, of course, when they were expressing their optimism earlier, you had Ned Price, may have been some other officials as well, maybe Malley or Blinken, but I'm sure it was Ned Price actually coming out and going, it's still too early to tell if they're taking a constructive approach and this kind of thing. So now before that, I'll also say that Ali Bagheri Khani, the lead negotiator, said that now, as I said, in the seventh round, they decided that because they said to the Europeans, you put forward your own proposals and then we'll discuss those. Like, we're glad to look at your proposals, but you haven't put anything forward. It's been weeks now. So ultimately, they agreed to the Iranians' terms. They put forward a draft proposal on sanctions relief and then also on their obligations to walk back the expansion and advancement of the nuclear program outside the written confines of the deal. They're still in the deal, of course. But anyway, they are saying now, that, yeah, the conversation, they were also complaining that they weren't focused enough on sanctions relief. They say it is now. He says some written changes on the lifting of sanctions were established between the two parties, and relative satisfactory progress has been made over the first days of the eighth round of negotiations. He says the discussions focused mainly on the lifting of sanctions. We hope that after a few days of pause, more serious work will continue on the question of lifting sanctions. So those are the talks that have resumed at this point since yesterday. At the same time, Yair Lapid, the Israeli foreign minister, has come out and he's talking about attacking Iran again. And he's even saying more provocative things like, we have capabilities that the experts of the world can't even imagine, and we may just go ahead and attack Iran without even warning the U.S. about it in advance. I find that hard to believe. At the same time, if they get really desperate, because they're afraid about losing their hegemony in the region, it's very possible they could do that. At the same time, he still said that he conceded that the wrong deal hasn't been made yet. So it's interesting. As we said last week, we have Isaac Herzog, the president, and even Bennett coming out and saying things like "deal or no deal." Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, and which is, as stupid as this idea of them searching for, seeking nuclear weapons is. It's baseless. The fact that the Israelis are kind of stepping down, that is a step down. This kind of deal or no deal. I would accept a good deal, not a bad deal. Like this is actually a concession. Even though it's disguised as more bluster. So Yeah, and then Ned Price came out today, I believe, or maybe it was yesterday, but I read the report from Dave DeCamp over at antiwar.com today that that Price came out, the State Department spokesman, and he said modest progress is being made. And he goes, the discussions are centering on sanctions relief. So again, that's another sign that what we said last week is turning out to be correct, that the Iranians are in fact gaining the advantage here in the talks. And the Americans and the Russians, there's not much detail on it, but they recently had a discussion. Ulanov, the lead negotiator there from Russia in Vienna, met with Robert Malley, the UN envoy, uh, and they put out kind of perfunctory statements about it. Although I think the Russians said it was a constructive conversation. So,
Yeah.
And they support Iran's position. So that could also be another good sign.
Yeah, and so Connor, before we move on and start talking about some other stuff, including Korea and some African countries, I did want to mention that on the anniversary, the second anniversary of the assassination of the now deceased Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, there were 3 events in the Middle East that I guess are being attributed to Iran, although I haven't seen like a big statement or the U.S. government make a big deal out of it yet. So interesting, the timing of this with Iran talks and everything, but also not surprising. Soleimani was a huge figure in the Middle East, and so, but the 3 events were 2 drones being fired, and now on 2 separate occasions. The first set of 2 drones being fired at the Baghdad airport. Apparently, they report that one of those drones had Soleimani's revenge on the wings of it. Of course, I believe the U.S. said in response to this, like, it's irresponsible to carry out an attack on a structure like the Baghdad airport, which is the ultimate hypocrisy, because that is, of course, where Soleimani was killed. And also to mention here, along with al-Mohandes, who was the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces and the Shia militias in Iraq, and for at least Iraq, not the Middle East at large, the loss of Mohandes may have been bigger to the Shia militias. And, that's just important to note that, there's more tied there. But also there were 2 drones fired at a U.S. base west of Baghdad. All the drones were intercepted. Nothing got anywhere near anything. Off the coast of Yemen, and I saw conflicting reports. Some people report this happened in the Red Sea, which would make more sense. Others reported it happened off the island of Skorhoda, which would be a little bit different because this is out in the Gulf of Aden, a little bit further from Houthi territory. But apparently there was a UAE ship that was seized. The Saudi coalition has claimed that there's medical supplies on the ship, and the Houthis claim they stole weapons. Who knows what the truth is? It could even be both. There could be medical supplies and weapons on the ship, for all I know. And, interesting there. And then the last act was the hacking of the Jerusalem Post's page. Only the website, only the front page. It said something about Soleimani on it, after it was hacked. I guess it's easy to attribute all these ads to Iran. Although, if you look at Iraq, the Shia militias could have done it because they're upset not only about Soleimani, but al-Mohandes, and that wouldn't be a huge surprise. Also, the Shia militias in Iraq act well outside of Iranian influence frequently, including with the assassination or the recent assassination attempt on the president, which Iran condemned, and the Iranian militia or the Iraqi militia seemed okay with it. The seizing the boat, the UAE boat, the Houthis aren't that connected to Iran, and probably would have had the smallest connection to Soleimani of any of the groups in the Middle East. So kind of interesting that the Houthis would take part. The Houthis do carry out operations against Iran. Not against Iran, against the UAE and the Saudi coalition. But that would be an awful strange coincidence. And so maybe the Iranians helped to provide intelligence or something there to the Houthis to seize the ship, but unclear of what role Iran had. And then the hacking of the website, it could have been done by literally anyone. And so while I'm not saying that it wasn't the Iranians who did it, without proof, I see, no reason to believe it. And so, with all the circumstances, it does seem like, this could have been acted by Iran. The Iranians, on the more just public relations level were putting out that they're very upset about it and that they want Donald Trump to be held responsible for the assassination, which of course is a non-starter ask. You know what I mean? Like, Bill Clinton's ever going to be held, responsible for starving Iraqis to death or anything. Like, they could say it, but they have to know it's not going to happen. So anyways, those are some things. The last thing I'll mention on Israel, Connor, is that apparently Poland now is caught up in the NSO group scandal and was spying on at least 3 dissidents. This article from Middle East Eye also interestingly lays out that in 5 countries, including Rwanda, Hungary, Azerbaijan, and then Poland, the sale of the Pegasus spyware to those countries coincided with visits from Benjamin Netanyahu. So it's interesting. Maybe he was just like slinging this stuff for the NSO group. Connor, anything else on Israel before we move on here?
I'll just add that I think Pompeo is still crazy enough to run for president. There's clips going around of him on Hannity last night repeating the lie that Soleimani was preparing an attack on Americans and we thwarted it, and isn't this great? And Hannity called it one of the most like daring and impressive military maneuvers of our lifetime, something like that. Yeah, and then Pompeo said. He said that, and he's talking up like what a hero he is and Trump was, and how he says we're faced by Iran's threat to the U.S. at this point. He goes, it's unprecedented, and all this kind of thing about, he goes, their capabilities with their terrorist proxies and the leading state sponsor of terror. And then I saw Dave DeCamp ran on Twitter today. Pompeo put out a tweet saying, the most important job of the Secretary of State, or something like this. If I'm paraphrasing it slightly off, please correct me, anybody. But he does say something like my most important job as Secretary of State is to stand with Israel, our greatest ally. So, what constituency he's playing to.
Right. And just real quick, I read the Hill article had the 10 most likely Republicans to run for president in 2024. It was Trump, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, Mike Pompeo, Chris Christie, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. And I just the list of absolute lunatics, it scared the hell out of me. But let's